If you were looking for the definitive symbol of the conflict between the cultures that had existed in the American West for at least 10,000 years, and maybe longer, and the culture that was just building east of the Mississippi River, this culture of technology, of commerce, of grasping after tomorrow before it arrives, you couldn't come up with two more powerful symbols than the railroad and the buffalo. Because when the railroad met the buffalo, the Iron Age met the Stone Age, the machine arrived in the garden, and the West was changed forever. T.H. Watkins.
This will be the work of giants, and Uncle Sam is the only giant we know who can grapple the subject, Abraham Lincoln.
President Abraham Lincoln authorized the development of the Transcontinental Railroad in the U.S. in 1862 with the Pacific Railroad Bill. This revolutionary plan connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts for the first time and securely tied the fledgling West to the Union. The construction of railroads to the West and America's reaction to this feat would be a key factor in beginning to mend scars left in the wake of the Civil War.
The writer of the Pacific Railroad Bill, former Union General and Iowa Congressman Samuel Curtis, was a strong supporter of a northern line, crossing through the Great Plains and into California. Others, however, like Jefferson Davis, pushed for a southern line, which they hoped would aid the South if they seceded from the Union. The Great Railroad debate would rage on for another 17 years, from the time of Asa Whitney's 1845 plan before Congress to the signing of the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862. This ambitious feat of merging technology and manpower would reform trade, commerce, communication, culture, and travel forever.
After the signing of the Pacific Railroad Bill, most of the Union's focus was primarily involved with the Civil War. Resources and manpower designated for the railroad were sacrificed for the Union's war effort. Chief Engineer Peter Day contacted Vice President of the UP, Thomas Durant, for assistance in gathering an army of men. Durant asked the government for freed slaves from the Civil War, and the government declined. General Grenville Dodge offered captured Indians from his military campaign, but that idea was turned down as well. By the end of 1865, the Union Pacific had only laid 40 miles of track. However, finally at the end of the Civil War, an abundance of idle veterans were eager for work.
Peter Day resigned and was soon replaced by Dodge, and Jack Casement was hired as construction boss on the Union Pacific.
Operating with military precision, Jack and his brother Dan would adopt a revolutionary form of building railroads never used before. Along freshly laid track, men called teamsters would steer horse-drawn carts. Next, men on each side of track would unload rails and place them parallel to each other. A second group of men, named gaugers, would check to see if rails were directly parallel to each other. A group of men called bolters would connect separated rails. Spike men would drop spikes onto the grade, and the hammermen would drive them into place. The coming of settlers into the Plains Indians' lands would create a revolution that would spur a series of events that would ultimately end in the destruction of the Native Americans' culture and the taking of their lands. The American bison, a religious and spiritual icon to the Sioux Indians, was nearly exterminated by sport hunters brought by the railroad, the separation of the herds by the railroad's tracks, and in some cases the bison were hunted for enjoyment or satisfaction. Even some men were hired on the Union Pacific to hunt the bison so there would be enough food for workers. Resistance was shared among the Sioux and other major Native American groups of the Great Plains, but the reaction of using brute force of the American military would quell any uprisings and force Native Americans onto reservations. For the Indians, the railroaders were nothing but a group of destruction seekers ravaging their native land and transforming their culture.
General William T. Sherman reflected a negative bias towards the Plains Indians. The more we can kill this year, the less will have to be killed the next year. The more I see of these Indians, the more convinced I am that they ought to be killed and maintained as a species of paupers.
The political revolution that significantly impacted the railroad took the face of corruption and greed, as exemplified by the Creditmobile scandal. Creditmobile was a construction company owned by influential members of the Union Pacific. Instead of paying contractors to build the railroad, the stockholders would pay themselves. By 1869, the Union Pacific was financially in shambles. Estimates range from $6 million to $23 million in debt.
The initial plans for the Union Pacific to move west were intended for a far more northern route. When Grenville Dodge went on a September 1865 expedition into the Black Hills, he found many Indian war parties in the area. Dodge went against his early idea and decided for a route through the Platte River Valley, a far more central route.
An aspiring engineer from New York, Theodore Judah, arrived in California in 1854. He had received a request from the Sacramento Valley Railroad president, Charles Wilson, to survey a route from Sacramento to Folsom, California. His growing convictions for a transcontinental railroad earned him the local name of Crazy Judah. In 1859, the Pacific Railroad Convention was held in San Francisco. Convention members chose Theodore Judah, the revolutionary figure with a dream that would change and reform our country forever, to ask Congress for federal assistance and present a set of recommendations.
Californian officials desired a transcontinental railroad to reform a transportation system that would ensure a bond to the northern states. Leaving San Francisco later that year, Judah was unable to convince Congress members that the idea was important because the issue of slavery had intensified prior to the Civil War erupting. After many failed attempts in trying to find able investors, Judah stumbled upon a small group of wealthy merchants. The four largest contributors, known as the Big Four, were Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, and Leland Stanford. Judah then traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1861, just after the start of the Civil War. Judah continued his vigorous lobbying efforts to secure additional funding. The Pacific Railroad Act was then signed by Abraham Lincoln on July 1, 1862.
On December 3, 1862, a major component of the ongoing revolution moved forward as the Central Pacific Railroad Company declared acceptance of the Pacific Railroad Bill. And on December 27, 1862, the contract for the first 18 miles of track was given to Charles Crocker. The significant conflict of labor shortage plagued the Central Pacific. With every group of 1,000 workers, only 100 of them would stay and work. In 1864, Chief of Construction Charles Crocker had only 600 workers. So in 1865, the Central Pacific decided to try the Chinese as a potential instrument of labor. Crocker's bold revolutionary move attracted disapproval from construction boss James Harvey Strobridge. However, by 1867, 12,000 of the 14,000 workers on the Central Pacific were Chinese immigrants. The Chinese laborers' reliability and distinction as a tireless group of workers eventually earned effective praise from railroad officials, including Leland Stanford.
The long-term effects of the Chinese workers on the American economic fabric was both extraordinary and revolutionary for the times. Their efforts led to workers' strike of 1867. This landmark event led to strikes of industrial employees in the 1870s, spawning the birth of trade unions in the U.S., as the revolutionary American labor movement was born.
Working through the rocky conditions of the Sierra Nevada proved to be a grueling task for workers. First, workers would hammer out a rail bed. Next, this dirt and rock would be removed in carts, and if necessary, trees would be removed. Tracks would be laid, spikes would be driven, and aqueducts built. When going through mountains, tunnels would be carved by use of black powder and nitroglycerin. On one instance, Chinese workers were placed in baskets and lowered over a 2,000-foot ledge dubbed Cape Horn.
The Central Pacific soon learned that the Union Pacific would be the winner of this monumental race. The main cause for the UP winning the race is because the treeless prairie that lay mostly ahead of the UP offered little resistance.
On May 10, 1869, the Central and Union Pacific joined at Promontory Summit, Utah. The Transcontinental Railroad transformed the United States into a world superpower and decreased coast-to-coast travel time from 6 months to 7 days. The opening of the West impacted the entire U.S. economy and enabled the U.S. exploitation of gold, silver, copper, coal, zinc, wood, and oil. The development of cattle and sheep ranches, wheat farms, and fruit and citrus orchards in the West totally reformed and opened the door to established foreign trade.
The Great Pacific Railways commenced. Immigration will soon pour into these valleys. Tens of millions of immigrants will settle in this golden land in 20 years. This is the grandest enterprise under God. George Francis Train.